The sky above Valyria was thick with smoke, its once vibrant hues now reduced to a stormy gray. Flashes of laser fire and bursts of plasma explosions painted the heavens in sickly greens and reds, while below, the city lay in ruins. Fires raged uncontrolled, consuming everything in their path, as the sound of gunfire and shouts echoed through the battered streets. Somewhere in the chaos, a young alien girl, Lira, lay pinned under the rubble of a crumbling building. Lira was an Eryllan, one of the few remaining on this war-torn world. Her pale, iridescent skin shimmered with an otherworldly glow, even as blood seeped from her injuries. She could barely breathe, each breath a painful rasp, as her chest rose and fell. Her wide, silver eyes filled with terror as she tried to call out, but her voice was barely a whisper. Around her, the ground trembled with the relentless march of soldiers from both the Tevron Dominion and the Orath Resistance, their faces hardened with battle fury. A massive Orath enforcer, clad in thick armor and armed with a plasma rifle, stopped before her. His four crimson eyes narrowed as he gazed down at the helpless child. She closed her eyes, waiting for the inevitable. But, to her surprise, the enforcer merely sneered before stepping over her, leaving her to bleed out alone amidst the wreckage. As he moved on, Lira felt a pang of hopelessness settle in. She whispered a quiet prayer to the ancient Eryllan spirits, begging for a savior. At that moment, across the battlefield, Gideon Ward, a seasoned medic with the United Earth Alliance, paused. He had heard something, a faint whimper beneath the roar of combat. Years of experience had honed his instincts, and he knew better than to ignore them. Moving quickly, he made his way towards the sound, ducking behind a shattered wall to avoid a burst of enemy fire. There, amidst the rubble, he found her, a tiny, fragile figure, barely conscious. Without hesitation, Gideon knelt beside Lira, his eyes scanning her injuries. Her legs were crushed, twisted at unnatural angles beneath the debris. Jagged shards of metal jutted from her abdomen, and her breathing was shallow. "Hold on, kid," he murmured, gently brushing a strand of dirt-caked hair from her face. "I'm here. I've got you." With practiced hands, Gideon began to clear the rubble away, mindful of her broken bones. Each movement was precise, every action deliberate. He knew that one wrong move could cost her life. "Stay with me, all right?" he whispered, glancing at her face as her eyes fluttered open, meeting his for the first time. "I'm going to get you out of here." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Gideon managed to free her. Cradling her fragile body in his arms, he began to assess the extent of her injuries. Lira let out a small, pained cry as he applied pressure to her wounds, his medkit in hand. He sprayed biofoam over the punctures in her abdomen, sealing them temporarily. "You're going to be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. Gideon activated his comm link, his voice urgent as he called for a medevac. "I've got a critical casualty here, an Eryllan child. She needs immediate surgery." But the reply he received was cold and unyielding. "Negative, Ward. Leave the alien and return to your post. We have our orders." Gideon's jaw tightened. He had seen too many innocent lives lost in this senseless war, too many children caught in the crossfire. "I'm not leaving her," he snapped, cutting off the link. He knew there would be consequences for disobeying orders, but he didn't care. This wasn't about protocols, it was about doing what was right. He adjusted Lira in his arms, feeling her small body tremble as he held her close. Her breaths were shallow, each one more labored than the last. Time was running out. He needed to get her to the Alliance's field hospital, 3 clicks east, through hostile territory. Gideon took a deep breath, steeling himself for the journey ahead. "Hang on, kid," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle. "You're going to live. I promise." Gideon moved swiftly, his steps careful as he navigated the rubble-strewn streets. The city was a labyrinth of destruction, each corner a potential death trap. He kept low, his eyes scanning for any sign of enemy soldiers. Lira stirred in his arms, her eyes opening briefly. "It hurts," she whispered, her voice barely more than a breath. "I know, sweetheart," Gideon replied, his heart clenching at the pain in her voice. "But you're going to be all right. Just hold on a little longer." He kept talking to her, his voice a steady anchor amidst the chaos. He told her about Earth, about the blue oceans and green forests, the snow-capped mountains and the vast open skies. He could see her relax slightly, her grip on his jacket tightening as she listened to his words. Suddenly, a burst of plasma fire erupted from a nearby alley, forcing Gideon to duck behind a crumbling wall. He pressed his back against the rough concrete, his heart pounding as he checked on Lira. Her eyes were closed, her breathing shallow, but she was still alive. "Stay with me, kid," he murmured, peering around the corner to assess the situation. A squad of Orcs soldiers was moving down the street, their heavy footsteps echoing through the empty buildings. Gideon waited until they had passed before continuing on, his steps quick and silent. He was almost at the intersection when he heard the high-pitched whistle of incoming artillery. His eyes widened, and he sprinted forward, diving into a doorway just as the shell exploded behind him, showering the street with shrapnel. Gideon's ears were ringing as he pushed himself to his feet, cradling Lira tightly. He checked her over, relieved to see that she was still breathing. "We're almost there," he whispered, brushing a strand of hair from her face. He could see the field hospital in the distance, its reinforced gates, a beacon of hope amidst the devastation. As he approached, the guards at the gate snapped to attention, their eyes widening at the sight of the wounded alien child in his arms. They waved him through without hesitation, and Gideon felt a wave of relief wash over him as medics rushed forward, carefully transferring Lira onto a hovering stretcher. Dr. Lira, the hospital's chief medical officer, was at the forefront. She placed a hand on Gideon's shoulder, her gaze fierce. "You did well, Sergeant. We'll take it from here." Gideon nodded, his throat tight as he watched them wheel Lira away. He knew she was in good hands, but the thought of leaving her filled him with a sense of loss he couldn't explain. Gideon had barely stepped outside the hospital when he was confronted by Captain Eryllan, his commanding officer. "What the hell were you thinking, Ward?" Locke demanded, his blue eyes flashing with anger. "You disobeyed a direct order. You put yourself and the mission at risk for an alien child." Gideon squared his shoulders, meeting Locke's gaze without flinching. "With all due respect, sir, I wasn't going to leave her to die. She's just a kid, an innocent caught in this madness. If we can't protect the innocent, then what's the point?" Locke sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I get it, Ward. I do. But there are rules, and those rules are there for a reason. You're a good soldier, but you can't just go rogue every time you see someone in trouble." Gideon braced himself for the inevitable reprimand. "What's it going to be, sir?" Locke studied him for a moment before speaking. "You've got two options, a demotion and reassignment to a non-combat role, or a court-martial. Your choice." The weight of the decision settled heavily on Gideon's shoulders. He thought of Lira fighting for her life in the operating room. "I'll take the demotion," he said finally, his voice steady. "But I want to stay with her until she's out of danger." Gideon spent the next few days by Lira's bedside, watching over her as she recovered. Under Dr. Cade's care, her wounds began to heal, her strength slowly returning. She had a resilience that surprised him, her spirit unbroken despite the horrors she had endured. As the days passed, word of Gideon's actions spread among the Eryllans. Lira became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there were those willing to risk everything for the sake of compassion. Slowly, a fragile peace began to take root, as humans and Eryllan started to reach out to one another, putting aside their differences to rebuild what had been lost. One evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Gideon sat by Lira's bed, holding her small hand in his. She looked up at him, her silver eyes bright with gratitude. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice filled with awe. Gideon smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "I made a promise, didn't I?" She reached under her pillow, pulling out a small, intricately carved charm. "This is for you," she said, pressing it into his hand. "It's an Eryllan charm for luck and protection, so you'll never forget me." Gideon felt a lump in his throat as he accepted the gift, the weight of it, a tangible reminder of the bond they had forged. "Thank you, Lira. I'll keep it with me, always." Years later, Gideon stood before a group of new recruits, his uniform now bearing the insignia of a medical instructor. He held up Lira's charm, its surface worn smooth by time. "This," he said, his voice steady, is a reminder of why we're here, not to fight, but to protect, to bring hope, even in the darkest of times. Remember that a single act of kindness can change the course of history. As he spoke, he knew that Lyra's story would live on, a testament to the power of compassion. And somewhere, across the stars, he hoped that Lira remembered him too, her guardian in a galaxy torn apart by war.